Have you ever walked away from a conversation feeling strangely defeated, even though you said everything you thought you should say? Not because you were wrong, not because you lacked arguments, but because the more you spoke, the smaller you felt. There is a quiet humiliation that comes from talking too much in the wrong moment. A subtle sense that every word you offered weakened your position instead of strengthening it. That every explanation handed the other person more control. Most people interpret this as a failure of communication. Nietzsche would say it is a failure of power. We are taught that speaking is strength, that defending yourself is necessary, that silence means weakness, submission, defeat. But what if that belief is the trap? What if the moment you feel compelled to respond is the exact moment you have already lost? Nietzsche saw something deeply unsettling about modern humans. They speak not because they have something to say, but because they cannot tolerate silence. They explain not because truth is unclear, but because their ego is threatened. They argue not to discover reality, but to protect identity. And in doing so, they reveal everything. Every emotional reaction exposes a weakness. Every justification reveals dependence. Every defensive word announces insecurity. Silence, on the other hand, reveals nothing. This video is not about becoming quieter. It is about becoming untouchable. Because silence is not the absence of power. It is power that refuses to beg for recognition. Nietzsche believed that most human interactions are not about truth or understanding. They are about dominance, status, control. People speak to position themselves above others, to assert moral superiority, to dominate the narrative. And the moment you feel the urge to correct, defend, or prove yourself, you have stepped into their game. A game designed for you to lose. The herd teaches you to react, to respond immediately, to show that you are reasonable, fair, articulate. But this constant need to be understood is not intelligence. It is obedience. The one who reacts is not in control. The one who waits is. Silence interrupts the expected script. It destabilizes the dynamic. It removes the other person's reference point. When you remain silent, the other is forced to confront themselves. Their own words echo back at them without resistance. Their own insecurity grows louder. Their own intentions become visible. This is why silence feels uncomfortable to most people. Not because it is empty, but because it is revealing. Nietzsche understood that human beings fear nothing more than exposure. And silence is exposure without accusation. You do not need to attack. You do not need to refute. You simply do not participate. And this non-participation is interpreted as judgment, even when none is spoken. This is the paradox. Silence appears passive, but it is deeply active. It requires discipline, restraint, mastery over impulse. Anyone can react. Only the strong can remain silent. Think about how often people talk themselves into weakness. They over-explain, they justify, they clarify until there is nothing left of their position. Nietzsche observed that those who speak the most often feel the least secure. They need constant validation. They need to be seen agreeing, nodding, responding. Silence denies them this nourishment, and without it, they unravel. This is why silence is often met with aggression, mockery, provocation. The other person tries to force you to react, to pull you back into the familiar exchange of noise. But if you do not move, if you do not bite, something remarkable happens. They reveal themselves, their tone sharpens, their arguments become repetitive, their emotional investment increases, and all the while you remain untouched. Nietzsche did not admire those who won arguments. He admired those who transcended them, because winning an argument still means you accepted its premise. You allowed yourself to be dragged into a contest of words. True power lies in not needing to compete at all. Silence communicates something terrifying to the other person. I do not need your approval. I am not threatened by your opinion. I do not require this exchange. And this message is louder than any speech. But here is the uncomfortable truth. Silence is difficult because it forces you to confront your own ego. The urge to respond is not about justice. It is about self-image, about wanting to be seen as intelligent, correct, superior. When you resist that urge, you strip the ego of its usual tools. And this feels like a loss before it becomes strength. Nietzsche would say this discomfort is necessary. It is the cost of self-mastery, because the one who cannot endure silence is still ruled by others, by their reactions, by their opinions, by their expectations. The one who can endure it begins to rule themselves. This is where silence transforms from a tactic into a state of being. It is no longer something you do. It is something you embody. You speak when it matters. You remain silent when it does not. And the world begins to treat you differently. Not because you demanded respect, but because you no longer chased it. And this is only the beginning. Because once you understand silence as power, you begin to see that not all silence is equal. Some silence is weakness. Some silence is fear. Some silence is submission. Nietzsche warned against confusing these. There is a silence that comes from repression, from swallowing anger, from avoiding conflict out of fear. This is not power, this is decay. And to understand the difference, you must go deeper, because silence can either enslave you or free you. And the line between the two is thinner than most people realize. Most people never learn this distinction. They believe all silence is the same. They confuse restraint with suppression, control with fear, strength with avoidance. Nietzsche would call this a dangerous misunderstanding. There is a silence that comes from lack of power, and there is a silence that comes from excess of it. The first is the silence of someone who wants to speak but feels they cannot. The second is the silence of someone who could speak but chooses not to. They look identical from the outside, but internally they are opposites. The silence of fear feels heavy. It tightens the body. It creates resentment. It accumulates unspoken anger that eventually leaks out in passive aggression, bitterness, self-contempt. This silence is not mastery. It is submission dressed up as politeness. Nietzsche despised this kind of silence. He saw it everywhere in modern society, in people who swallow their instincts to be liked, who mute themselves to fit in, who confuse harmony with self-erasure. This is what he meant by herd morality. A morality that praises meekness, not because it is noble, but because it is manageable. A system that rewards those who do not disturb, do not challenge, do not stand apart. In this world, silence becomes a cage. But there is another silence, a silence that does not shrink you, a silence that expands you. This silence does not come from fear of conflict. It comes from indifference to unnecessary conflict. It is not the silence of someone who has nothing to say. It is the silence of someone who sees no value in saying it. This is the silence Nietzsche associated with higher types of humans, those who have outgrown the need to constantly assert themselves. They do not react because they are not provoked internally. They do not defend because they are not under threat. They do not explain because they do not seek permission to exist. Their silence is grounded, and grounding is terrifying to those who live by reaction. When you stop reacting, you disrupt a hidden contract. Most interactions are based on predictable emotional exchanges. I provoke, you respond. I accuse, you defend. I perform, you validate. Silence breaks this rhythm. It removes the other person's leverage. Without your reaction, their behavior floats without anchor, and floating makes people panic. This is why silence often escalates situations before it resolves them. The other person speaks louder, repeats themselves, it becomes more emotional. They are trying to regain control, and if you stay still long enough, they reveal their intention. Nietzsche understood power not as domination over others, but as sovereignty over oneself. The one who governs their impulses governs the interaction. This is why silence is not weakness. It is delayed force. It is force that waits for the precise moment. Think about how predators move. They do not chase everything that moves. They conserve energy. They observe. Only when the moment is right do they act. Humans who lack this restraint exhaust themselves. They argue with everyone, correct everything, react to every provocation, and in doing so they broadcast their vulnerabilities. Silence conceals. It creates asymmetry. The silent person knows more than the speaking one, because speech reveals, silence collects. This is why manipulators fear silence. Manipulation requires feedback. It needs reactions to calibrate control. When you do not respond, the manipulator loses orientation. They do not know if they succeeded. They do not know where they stand. And uncertainty destabilizes them. But here is where most people misuse silence. They remain silent outwardly, but inwardly they are screaming. Their mind is racing, rehearsing responses, seeking validation. This is not silence, this is repression. Nietzsche would say true silence begins internally, when you no longer need to win, when you no longer need to correct, when you no longer need to be seen as right. This internal shift changes everything. Because then silence is not effortful, it is natural. You are not biting your tongue. You simply do not feel the impulse. And when you do speak, it lands differently. Your words carry weight because they are rare. They are not diluted by constant noise. People listen not because you are loud, but because you are selective. This selectivity creates authority, not the authority of titles or status, but the authority of presence. Nietzsche believed presence was the true mark of power, the ability to stand without justification. Most people cannot do this. They need constant explanation to feel real. Silence deprives them of this comfort, and this is why it feels dangerous. Because silence forces confrontation with oneself, and most people avoid that at all costs. But there is still another layer. Because silence does not only affect others, it reshapes you. When you stop reacting, you reclaim energy. Energy previously wasted on defense, justification, performance. This energy returns to you as clarity. You begin to see patterns, motives, games. You are no longer inside the interaction, you are above it. And from that position, something shifts. You realize that many situations are only conflicts if you agree to participate. Without your engagement, they collapse. This is the first glimpse of true freedom, but it comes with a price, because when you stop playing the game pushes back. And this is where silence is tested, not in calm moments, but when pressure rises, when you are accused, misunderstood, provoked deliberately. This is where most people break, and this is where silence either reveals mastery or exposes fear. To understand how to hold silence under pressure, you must confront something deeper. The part of you that still wants approval, still wants control through words, still fears being misjudged. Nietzsche would say this is where the real battle begins, not with others, but with yourself. And this battle is not fought with arguments, it is fought with restraint, with the ability to let discomfort pass without reacting, with the courage to let others think what they want. Because the moment you no longer need to manage others' perceptions, you become unmanageable. And this is precisely what most people cannot tolerate, which is why silence, when mastered, becomes one of the most disruptive forces in any social environment. But we have not yet reached the core, because silence is not only a social weapon, it is a psychological one. And to understand its deepest power, you must see what silence does inside the mind of the other. That is where it truly becomes dangerous. Silence does something words never can. It removes the mirror people use to stabilize themselves. Most individuals do not speak to communicate truth. They speak to regulate their inner state. They speak to reassure themselves they matter, that they are heard, that they exist. When you respond, even in disagreement, you confirm their reality. When you remain silent, you deny them that confirmation. And the mind does not tolerate that vacuum well. Psychologically, silence creates what is known as an ambiguity gap. The brain is wired to resolve uncertainty. When it cannot, it fills the gap with projections. This is where silence becomes dangerous. The other person begins to imagine. They wonder what you think, what you know, what you judge. And in that wondering, their own fears surface. They project their insecurities onto your quiet. They assume arrogance, contempt, superiority, hidden aggression, not because those things are present, but because they already exist inside them. Silence becomes a psychological mirror, and most people hate mirrors. Nietzsche understood this instinctively. He believed that the average person lives in a state of constant self-deception, propped up by noise, routine, and external validation. Silence interrupts that anesthesia. It forces self-awareness. And self-awareness, for the unprepared, feels like threat. This is why silence often provokes hostility. People accuse the silent person of being cold, disrespectful, passive-aggressive, but what they are really reacting to is exposure. Your silence has made them visible to themselves, and that is unbearable for someone who depends on performance. There is another reaction as well. Some people become desperate. They over-explain, overshare, reveal too much. They talk faster, louder, with less coherence. They are trying to regain control of the narrative, but the more they speak, the more they lose it. Because speech under pressure leaks truth. Contradictions appear, motives slip. And if you are silent and observant, you see everything. This is why silence is not neutral, it is asymmetrical. You gain information, they lose composure. And this imbalance shifts power without confrontation. But there is a deeper reason silence works so effectively. It bypasses the ego. Words engage the ego. They invite debate, resistance, defense. Silence bypasses all of that and goes straight to the nervous system. The body interprets silence as significance, as seriousness, as judgment. This is why a pause can feel heavier than an insult. Nietzsche believed that modern humans are deeply uncomfortable with stillness because stillness confronts them with themselves. Noise distracts, silence reveals. And in a world addicted to distraction, the one who can remain silent appears almost inhuman. This is why silence creates authority without force. Authority is not imposed, it is inferred. People assume that the silent person knows something they do not. Whether or not that is true becomes irrelevant. Perception shifts, and perception governs interaction. This is the essence of psychological leverage. But here is the danger. If you use silence purely as a tactic, it will fail. Because silence is not something you do, it is something you become. If inside you are tense, angry, reactive, the silence will leak. Your body language will betray you. Your eyes will flicker, your posture will collapse, and others will sense weakness. Silence only works when it is aligned, when your inner state matches your outer restraint. Nietzsche would say this alignment is rare. Most people either speak what they do not mean or silence what they desperately want to say. Both are forms of slavery. True silence arises when there is nothing to defend, when your identity is not at stake, when you are no longer negotiating your worth through interaction. This is why silence is inseparable from self-mastery. You cannot fake it for long. Eventually, pressure reveals the truth. And this brings us to a critical distinction. Silence can either elevate you or erase you. The difference lies in intention. If your silence comes from fear of rejection, it makes you invisible. If it comes from clarity, it makes you untouchable. Nietzsche warned against confusing these two. He despised the silence of resentment, the silence of those who swallow anger and call it virtue. That silence poisons the soul. It turns inward. It corrodes. This is not power. This is decay. True silence does not accumulate bitterness. It releases it. Because you are not holding back, you are letting go. Letting go of the need to control outcomes. Letting go of the need to be understood by everyone. Letting go of the illusion that every interaction requires your participation. And when you let go, something unexpected happens. You become lighter. Interactions lose urgency. Provocations lose meaning. You realize how many situations were only draining because you fed them. Without your energy, they starve. This is the moment silence transforms from a defensive posture into an offensive one. Not aggressive, but decisive. You begin choosing when to engage, and when you do, it is deliberate, minimal, precise. A single sentence, spoken after long silence, can end a discussion. Not because it is clever, but because it is weighted. The silence before it gave it mass. Nietzsche believed that the highest form of strength was economy. Economy of emotion, economy of action, economy of speech. The strongest forces in nature move slowly. They do not rush. They do not explain. They simply alter reality. And this is where silence reaches its most dangerous form, when it is no longer reactive, but strategic. When you understand when not to speak, when not to clarify, when not to defend, and when to let others expose themselves through excess. At this level, silence is no longer about winning arguments. It is about shaping the field. And once you grasp this, the question changes. It is no longer how to outsmart others. It becomes whether you are willing to step into the responsibility this power requires. Because mastery of silence is not harmless. It changes how people relate to you. Some will respect you more. Others will resent you. Some will become cautious. Others will become hostile. You will no longer be easy to read, or manipulate, or dominate. And that brings consequences, and which is why most people retreat back into noise. Because silence demands that you stand alone. It demands that you tolerate misunderstanding. It demands that you relinquish the comfort of approval. And this is where Nietzsche draws the final line, between those who need the herd and those who are willing to walk apart. Because silence, when fully embodied, does not just outsmart others. It reveals who you are becoming. And not everyone is ready for that. Which leads us to the final truth. Silence is not just a tool, it is a transformation. And once you step into it fully, there is no going back. Only forward, into a different way of existing altogether. At this point, something subtle has already shifted inside you. If you have been listening closely, you may notice it. A slowing, a sense of distance from the urgency that once controlled you. That is not detachment, that is sovereignty. When you stop reacting, you step outside the machinery that feeds on reaction. Most social conflict survives on momentum. Words create speed. Speed creates escalation. Escalation creates loss of control. Silence breaks the chain. And once the chain is broken, you see the situation clearly for what it is. Not a battle for truth, not a moral struggle, but an exchange of energy. Someone is trying to take something from you. Attention, validation, dominance, emotional labor. And silence is how you refuse the transaction. Nietzsche would say that the highest victory is not defeating another, but refusing to be diminished. That is what silence does. It does not humiliate. It does not attack. It simply withholds access. And nothing terrifies a weak will more than denied access. This is why silence must be paired with presence. Not withdrawal, not avoidance. Presence. You do not disappear. You remain. You look. You listen. You stand grounded in your body, your posture steady, your breath slow, your eyes calm. This is not passive. It is confrontational without hostility. And that is why it is so destabilizing. Because there is nothing to fight, no words to twist, no emotion to exploit, only a person who is no longer available for the game. At this stage, silence becomes a boundary, a living one. It signals where you end and others begin. Most people have never experienced this. They are used to pushing, probing, provoking. They expect movement, resistance, compliance. Silence gives them none of it. And in that absence, they reveal themselves. Some back away, some grow aggressive, some attempt charm, some attempt guilt. All of these are strategies. And because you are not reacting, you see them clearly. You are no longer inside the interaction. You are above it. Nietzsche believed that the individual who masters themselves transcends morality built on weakness. They do not seek revenge. They do not seek approval. They do not seek dominance for its own sake. They seek alignment. Silence becomes an expression of that alignment. You speak only when your words add weight. You act only when action is necessary. You conserve energy, and energy is power. But here is the final warning. Silence is not about suppressing your truth. If something must be said, it should be said cleanly, briefly, without justification, without emotional spillover. Silence is not avoidance. It is preparation. It is discernment. You are not silent because you are afraid. You are silent because you are clear. And clarity is intimidating. In time, you will notice something else. People begin adjusting themselves around you. They speak more carefully, they test less, they sense boundaries without being told. Not because you demanded respect, but because your presence no longer negotiates it. This is what Nietzsche meant by strength without force. Power that does not announce itself. Authority that does not shout. In a world addicted to noise, restraint becomes rare, and rarity commands attention. But the greatest shift happens internally. You stop rehearsing conversations in your head. You stop carrying arguments home with you. You stop replaying moments wishing you had said something different, because you no longer need closure through words. Your nervous system learns something new, that you can remain intact without explaining yourself, that you can walk away without losing dignity, that you can hold silence without losing identity. This is liberation, not from others, but from the compulsive need to respond. And once you experience this freedom, you cannot unlearn it. You begin choosing your battles so carefully that most disappear, not because you are weak, but because you are selective. Nietzsche believed that the strong do not fight often. They do not need to. Their presence already communicates limits. So ask yourself now, how many conflicts in your life exist only because you keep feeding them? How many arguments continue because you keep showing up? How much of your energy is spent reacting instead of directing? Silence is how you reclaim that energy. Not dramatically, not loudly, but decisively. And this is the final truth. Silence does not make you invisible. It makes you unmistakable. It tells the world you are no longer available for triviality, that your time is measured, that your attention is sacred. And when you live this way, everything changes. Conversations become shorter. Respect becomes automatic. Manipulation becomes obvious. And peace becomes possible. Not because the world grew kinder, but because you grew stronger. So if you take nothing else from this, remember this. The weak shout to be seen. The insecure argue to exist. The strong remain silent because they already know who they are. And when you know who you are, words become optional. Presence does the work. Silence speaks. And those who understand it never need to say another word.